Welcome back. This time we're looking at the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess, Queen, Grandmother of modern Europe. Eleanor was one of the most powerful and consequential women of the Middle Ages. Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Queen of France, Queen of England, participant in the Second Crusade, political prisoner, regent, patron of culture, and matriarch of a dynasty that reshaped Western Europe. She lived at the centre of 12th century power politics for over 6 decades. Her life sheds light on feudal inheritance, crusading ideology, court culture, dynastic state building, and the possibilities, however limited, of female authority in a profoundly male world. It's an amazing life, but fair warning, it's also a bit of a soap opera. There are a lot of twists and turns in this one. So, as you'll know from the last episode on Hildegard of Bingen, Europe in the High Middle Ages, from the period of roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, is a patchwork of principalities, duchies, and kingdoms. The two main political spheres are the Holy Roman Empire, which we looked at a little bit when we looked at Hildegard's background, and which covers what today are the countries of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Northern Italy, and parts of the Low Countries, and the Kingdom of France. At this point, 12th and 13th centuries, France is a feudal kingdom. So what that means is it's divided into territories, each of which is ruled by a duke or a count, and all of them owe loyalty to a king. The king, in comparative terms, is relatively poor and doesn't directly control a lot of land, certainly not in comparison to some of the dukes. But he's the king and divinely appointed, and kingship is held hereditarily, so he's relatively secure. Just to add to the complexity though, at this time, about half of what we know today as France is held not by French dukes or by the French king, but by the English king. That technically the King of France is legally superior when it comes to the administration of those parts of the country. But in the real world, the King of England is militarily and economically superior, like many of the French dukes. So the whole situation is a recipe for conflict. So this is the world into which Eleanor is born in around 1122, most likely in Poitiers, the capital of the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the largest and wealthiest territories in France. Aquitaine is this vast duchy stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, culturally distinct, economically vibrant, and it's only loosely tied to the French crown. When her father, William X, dies in 1137, Eleanor, who's still a teenager, becomes Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. And this is an important thing to remember. She's not powerful because she marries kings. However you feel about inherited wealth, she's powerful in her own right. Kings and other nobles seek her because she's the ruler of Aquitaine, meaning she possesses one of the richest inheritances in Europe. And before he dies, William places Eleanor under the guardianship of King Louis VI of France, which is a smart move. This protects her and her lands. She's 15 years old. She's a teenage heiress ruling a vast, rich territory alone and is hugely vulnerable. If William had died without arranging protection, Aquitaine could have been seized through abduction, coercive marriage, noble revolt, or just opportunistic intervention by neighbouring rulers. And none of this is hypothetical to Eleanor's situation. Heiresses are routinely targeted in precisely this way, kidnapped and forced to marry for their inheritance. Now, under feudal norms, the guardian of an heiress has substantial influence over her marriage. So by entrusting Eleanor to Louis, William effectively prevents local Aquitanian magnates from claiming her, and he opens the door to a royal marriage. And William almost certainly intends Eleanor to marry into the French royal house. Within months of William's death, she's married to Louis's son, the future Louis VII, and that kind of arrangement doesn't happen because two young people meet and fall in love and decide on the spur of the moment to get married. This is an alliance that takes a long time to arrange. Medieval royal marriages could be negotiated rapidly, but 3 months from William's death to royal wedding probably means there was at least a pre-existing agreement and certainly no opposition from Louis VI. The marriage takes place in July 1137. Just a few weeks later, Louis VI dies of dysentery. In the space of less than 6 months, Eleanor has lost a father, gained a husband, inherited a huge duchy, and become Queen of France. She is still only 16 years old. So, through the marriage, the French crown gains theoretical access to Aquitaine, but in practice, Eleanor remains Duchess of Aquitaine and the lands stay her own. They don't become crown territory. This will become important later. Now, Eleanor's marriage to Louis is politically advantageous to them both, but personally, it's not so much fun. They aren't really a good match. Louis was the second son and had originally been destined for the church before the death of his older brother made him heir. He's pious, serious, and cautious. He is very different to Eleanor, who was raised in the sophisticated court culture of southern France, exposed to poetry, troubadours, aristocratic ceremony. This difference between them starts to become visible during the Second Crusade. Now, by the 1140s, the unity that had fueled the First Crusade is gone. The Crusader states are divided and quarrelling amongst themselves. Meanwhile, Muslim political power is becoming more consolidated. Edessa is the capital of the first of the Crusader states, founded during the First Crusade, and it functions as a buffer between Antioch and the Muslim world. But it's vulnerable because its ruling count, Jocelyn II, is politically weak. Much of its army is away from the city and it lacks strong allies nearby. Muslim forces lay siege to the city, and on Christmas Eve of 1144, they capture it. This is a terrible shock to the Christian world. The First Crusade had ended in spectacular success. Jerusalem captured, Crusader states established, and for nearly 50 years, despite constant warfare, no major Crusader state has fallen. Edessa's collapse is the first major territorial loss of the Latin East and a blow to Crusader confidence. In Western Europe, the idea that Christian lands reclaimed at such cost during the First Crusade are now being lost stirs deep anxiety. When news reaches Pope Eugenius III, he issues a papal bull calling for a new crusade. 2 kings answer his call: Conrad III, King of the Romans and ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, and Louis VII. The 2 major powers in Europe are now involved in the crusade. Joining a crusade is seen as spiritually transformative. It promises the remission of one's sins, and for a deeply religious society, that matters enormously. For a king, refusal to take up the cross would have been morally and politically almost impossible. For a queen, especially one from a powerful, crusading, aristocratic culture like Aquitaine, participation aligns her with Christian piety and dynastic honour, and so she accompanies her husband. She doesn't go merely as the king's wife, she's still Duchess of Aquitaine, and Aquitaine owes military service. If Louis is going east, Aquitaine has to supply knights. So as Duchess, Eleanor has symbolic and feudal reasons to accompany her own vassals. She isn't going to command in battle, but her presence reinforces the loyalty of Aquitanian nobles on the campaign. Her marriage to Louis is already strained, so going on the crusade offers a shared religious enterprise and a chance to produce a male heir. Some believe holy pilgrimage might invite divine favour. It's a fun project they can do together, maybe bring the spark back, and it gives Louis a reset of his image after some earlier political failures. When they set off in 1147, expectations are high.
The First Crusade had succeeded spectacularly, so there's a precedent for triumph. She's probably expecting, they probably all are, a triumphant pilgrimage, diplomatic encounters with Eastern rulers, possibly even an expansion of influence. What they get is something very different. The Crusade is a disaster. In Antioch in 1148, Eleanor supports her husband Raymond of Poitiers against her husband. Raymond advocates a campaign in northern Syria rather than a pilgrimage-style march to Jerusalem. Louis rejects that plan and decides on an overland march through Anatolia, which ends up devastating the Crusader armies. The whole crusade collapses completely after the botched 1148 siege of Damascus, where disunity and poor planning forces a humiliating retreat, and the couple return to France on separate ships. And so we reach the first irony in this story. The crusade, which was in part intended to strengthen their marriage, ends up contributing to its collapse. Tensions escalate, the crusade's failure only intensifies the marital strain, and after 15 years of marriage, the couple have produced only 2 daughters and no surviving sons. In 1152, the union is annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. And consanguinity basically means that they're too closely related to be married. They share the same blood. It's a convenient mechanism for political reasons. They don't just realise after 15 years, oh no, we're related. They've always been related within the church's prohibited degrees of kinship. Probably 4th cousins, possibly slightly closer. But that's completely normal among high medieval royalty. In fact, most medieval royal marriages involve some degree of consanguinity. Consanguinity was useful though because it doesn't imply any moral failure, it preserves the legitimacy of their daughters, and it frames the separation as obedience to church law. In medieval legal culture, this is the cleanest possible exit. It never came up before because consanguinity only becomes a problem when a marriage becomes a problem, when it becomes politically inconvenient. For a medieval dynasty, the absence of a son is a serious political vulnerability. This alone creates pressure, but there's also the clash of personalities and cultures. Their incompatibility is widely remarked upon by contemporaries. Most historians think Louis initiates the separation, or at least formally drives it, even if Eleanor is willing and increasingly eager to agree. Louis has a broader political picture to think of. With no sons, the Capetian succession is insecure. The Capetian monarchy had no precedent for female succession, and a male heir was considered politically essential. Annulling the marriage solves multiple problems at once, but most importantly, it means Louis can remarry and seek a male heir, which he does, and he eventually has a son, Philip II. And here we reach the second irony. If Louis does initiate the annulment, primarily to secure a male heir, that decision is one of the great political miscalculations in medieval history. The annulment meant to stabilise Capetian succession immediately produces the opposite effect. Freeing Eleanor frees Aquitaine. Within 8 weeks, Eleanor marries Henry Plantagenet. 2 years later, he becomes King Henry II of England, and she becomes queen. She is just 32 years old. Aquitaine passes into English hands and becomes the foundation of a rival empire that will plague the Capetians for generations. The decision that freed Louis from an inconvenient marriage helps create the Angevin Empire, which greatly destabilizes the French monarchy and intensifies centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. And here we have to note something important. Eleanor marries Henry within 8 weeks of the annulment of her marriage to Louis. That speed strongly implies a lot of planning behind the scenes so that she was ready to move immediately she was free. We'll look at that in detail next time when we look at Eleanor's tempestuous marriage to Henry. But for now, thanks for joining me. Please remember to feed the algorithm by liking, sharing and subscribing on the way out. It really does help a small channel like this. And remember, whatever you're up to, have a great day.